Today they went over to York. It was after 7 when he dropped her off. He generally comes in, but not this time. Just gives her a little kiss. She has to bend down. I said, "Have you had a good time?" She said, "Yes. We had egg and chips, tea, bread and butter. We've got a lot in common, and there's a grand new car park." I said, "Did you go in the Minster?" She said, "No. Frank's not keen on old buildings. We need to look more to the future." He says they built a spanking new precinct in Bedford, so that's going to be next on the agenda. You're quiet. I said, "Well, do you wonder? Dr. Chowdhury says I should have a stable environment. This isn't a stable environment with your fancy men popping in every 5 minutes. She said, "He isn't my fancy man." I said, "Well, he's your fancy man in embryo." She said, "You know I don't know what that means." I said, "How old are you?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "You do know." She said, "I don't." "Tell me." I said, "You're 72. That's not so old. How old was Winston Churchill?" I said, "When?" She said, "Do you think you've got it over me, Graham Whittaker? Well, I'll tell you something. My memory's better with Frank. He was telling me about the economy. You've got it all wrong." I said, "How?" "I can't remember, but you have. Blaming it on the government. Frank says it's the blacks." I didn't say anything, just came upstairs. When I went down again, she still sat there with her hat and coat on. I said, "Do you want to knit him a tea cosy?" She said, "I don't think he's the tea cosy type. When I first knew him, he had a motorbike and sidecar. Besides, I think it's got beyond the tea cosy stage." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Graham, my one aim in life is for you to be happy. If I thought that by dying I would make you happy, I would." I said, "Mother, your dying wouldn't make me happy. In fact, the reverse. It would make me unhappy. Anyway, Mother, you're not going to die." She said, "No, I'm not going to die. I'm going to get married, and the honeymoon is in Tenerife. Have one of your tablets." She made a cup of tea. I said, "How can you go to Tenerife? You're smothered at Scarborough." She said, "It's a 4-star hotel with tip-top air conditioning. You get your breakfast from a long table." I said, "What about your bowels?" She said, "What about my bowels?" "Well, you said they were unpredictable at Morecambe. Get them to the Canary Islands and they're going to be all over the place." She said, "Who's talking about the Canary Islands? I'm going to Tenerife." "And what about post-Tenerife? Where are you going to live?" She said, "Here. Frank says he'll be away on and off on business, but he wants to call this home." I said, "What about me?" She went into the kitchen. "Well, we wondered whether you'd prefer to go back to the hostel. You were happy at the hostel. You rubbed shoulders with all sorts." I said, "Ma'am, this is my home." She said, "A man shouldn't be living with his mother at your age, Frank says." Did you take your tablet? Now it's 4 o'clock in the morning and I can't sleep. There's a car parked outside. I can't see it, but I think there's somebody in it, watching like they used to do before. I thought all that chapter was closed. This morning I went to community caring down at the health centre. It caters for all sorts. Steve, who runs it, is dead against what he calls the ghetto approach. What he's after is a nice mix of personality difficulties, as being the most fruitful exercise in problem solving, and a more realistic model of society generally. There's a constant flow of coffee. Oiling the wheels, Steve calls it, and we're all encouraged to ventilate our problems, and generally let our hair down. I sometimes feel a bit out of it, as I've never had any particular problems. So this time when Steve says, "Now, chaps and chapesses, who's going to set the ball rolling?" I get in quick and tell them about Mother and Mr. Turnbull. When I'd finished, Steve said, "Thank you, Graham. for sharing your problem with us. Does anybody want to kick it around? First off the mark is Leonard, who wonders whether Graham has sufficiently appreciated that old people can fall in love and have meaningful relationships generally, the same as young people. I suppose this is understandable coming from Leonard because he's 65, only he doesn't have meaningful relationships. He's been had up for exposing himself in Sainsbury's doorway. As Mother said, Tesco, you could understand it. Then Janice chips in. Had they been having sexual intercourse? I said I didn't want to think about it. Steve said, why? I said I didn't know. So he said, maybe what we should be talking about is why Graham is being so defensive about sexual intercourse. I said, Steve, I'm not being defensive about sexual intercourse. She's my mother. Jackie, who's 9 parts lesbian, said, Graham, she is also a woman. I couldn't believe this. I said, Jackie, you're an ex-battered wife. I thought you didn't approve of marriage. She said, Graham, I approve of caring marriage. I said, Jackie, this is not caring marriage. She said, Graham, what's Tenerife? That's caring. All I got was a black eye and a day trip to Fleetwood. Then they all have a go. Get Graham. Steve summed up. The general feeling of the group is that Graham could be more open. I said, how could I be more open? There's somebody sat outside the house watching. I wanted to discuss that. Only Leonard leaped in and said he felt the need to talk through an episode behind British Home Stores. I stuck it a bit longer and then came home. Mother's sat there, all dolled up, earrings on, chiffon scarf, lathered in makeup. She said, oh, I thought you were Mr. Turnbull. I said, no. She said, I'll just go to the lav. She goes 3 times in the next 10 minutes. I said, you're getting married today, are you? She said, no. There's a new Asda superstore opened at Bingley, and we thought we'd give it the once over. Frank says they have a very good selection of suntan lotions. I said, Mother, there's somebody watching the house. She said, I want to pick out some tissues, and Frank's looking for a chamois for the windscreen. He's promised me something called a cheeseburger. There's a cafe that's part of the complex. Just then there's a little toot on the horn, and she runs to the lav again. I said, don't go. Don't leave me, Mum. She said, I'm not giving in to you. You're a grown man. Is my underskirt showing? He toots again. She says, look at your magazines. Make yourself a poached egg. I said, Ma'am. She said, there's a bit of chicken in the fridge. You could iron those 2 vests. Take a tablet. Give us a kiss. Toodle pip. I thought I'd sit in the back room where they couldn't see me. I pulled the curtains and I'm sitting there in the dark, and I think I hear a knock at the door. I don't move, and there's another knock, louder. I do like Dr. Chowdhury says, and tell myself it's not happening. Only it is. Somebody shouts through the letterbox, I know you're in there, open this door. So I do, and there is someone. It's a woman. She said, are you the son? I said, what? She said, are you the son? I'm the daughter. I said, have you been watching the house? She says, on and off. Why? I said, nothing. She said, I don't know what there is to look so suited about. I said, you'd better come in.